She didn't know who she was saving yet. That was the thing about walking through Cedar Creek Medical in Norfolk. Natalie Hayes had become so practiced at disappearing that even the people she passed twice a day couldn't tell you her eye color. Dark scrubs. Tired eyes. Hands that moved like muscle memory, which they were. The Pentagon had been very clear about that. After Ramadi, after the operation that didn't officially happen, the service records were erased. The medal stayed in a show box. The photograph stayed in her locker. And Captain Natalie Hayes became just another nurse in the 0600 shift shuffle, pushing a supply cart down a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, her left hand tucked deep in her pocket where no one could see the tremor that came and went like ghost pain. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn above her head. Natalie moved through the ER with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from 12 years of combat medicine, though no one here would ever know that. No one here knew anything. That was the arrangement. In the break room, nurses gossiped about the new attending and the residents who'd gotten written up for chart errors. Natalie poured coffee into a chipped mug and said nothing. The silence had become her uniform, more protective than the dark scrubs. Her locker was in the back corner of the women's locker room, tucked behind the electrical panel where foot traffic was minimal. She opened it at 5:47 a.m., same time every morning, and her eyes found the photograph first, her team in 2010, standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter at Bagram before everything became Ramadi. Sergeant Marcus Webb with that grin that made people trust him immediately. Corporal James Chen with the camera always around his neck. Major David Holloway, whose call sign was Breaker, with his arm around her shoulders like they weren't about to walk into something that would change the definition of survival. She'd been captain then too, though the rank meant different things when there were IEDs in the date palms and your medic bag held the only thing between a teammate and exsanguination. Below the photograph sat the folded flag. Not displayed, never on a shelf where someone might ask questions. Just folded the way the military folds them, a tight triangle that fit in the palm of her hand. One of her teammates, the one who didn't walk out of Ramadi, had been buried with flag number 1. This flag had come home in a box with a letter from the Pentagon that said, "Classified operation and never discuss, and your service record has been archived for security purposes." Archived. That was the word they used instead of erased. Natalie ran her finger along the edge of the flag's triangle. The fabric was cool. She didn't cry anymore. Crying was something the old version of her did, the version before she learned that pain was information, and information was survival. She tucked the flag back behind the spare scrubs, closed the locker, and went back into the ER. The morning was moving at the pace they all moved at, controlled chaos punctuated by moments of genuine quiet that never lasted long enough. Natalie checked on the 2 patients in Trauma Bay 1, assessed vitals on the drunk who'd been brought in from Granby Street at 0330, and organized the supply cart with the kind of precision that made the younger nurses watch her sometimes with confusion. They didn't understand how someone could remember exactly where 147 different items belonged, or move with such efficiency that they never seemed rushed. Captain Natalie Hayes had organized medical supplies in convoy trucks moving through hostile territory at 60 kilometers per hour. A supply cart in a climate-controlled hospital was a vacation. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching Dr. Marcus Mercer move through his ward like he owned it, which he essentially did. Mercer had the kind of face that belonged in a pharmaceutical commercial, sharp cheekbones, expensive watch, the sort of confidence that came from a family tree full of money and connections. His white coat fit like it was tailored specifically to his shoulders. When he walked into a room, the air seemed to reorganize itself around him. Nurses straightened. Residents found things to do. Natalie kept her head down and her movements small. She was checking the medication login bay for at 0657 when the ER doors exploded open with the kind of controlled urgency that meant nothing good. 1 stretcher, 2 paramedics calling vitals in rapid-fire succession. Natalie's head lifted before her brain caught up to what her body already knew, the physical vocabulary of a trauma alert, the specific rhythm of someone coding hard. 64 male, 4 vehicle MVA on IU-64, ejection, GCS of 4, explosive decompression abdomen, we've got 2 large bore 4s running and he's been bagged the whole way, vitals are all over the map, BP dropping now, 90/50 and falling. The lead paramedic's voice carried the particular exhaustion of someone who'd already done everything they could, and it still might not be enough. Natalie moved toward Trauma Bay 3 without thinking about it. That was the problem with muscle memory, it didn't ask permission. Her hands were already reaching for the crash cart before Dr. Mercer's voice cut through the noise like a surgical blade. "Ms. Hayes." Not urgent. Conversational, even. The kind of tone that pulled attention like gravity. He was standing between her and the trauma bay, his posture relaxed, his smile manufactured into something that resembled warmth. Behind him, the stretcher swept past. The general, Natalie recognized him immediately, could place the face within 0.7 seconds because recognition was another skill Ramadi had taught her, was unconscious and bleeding, his chest moving only because the paramedics were breathing for him. "Doctor." She kept her voice neutral. Deferential. The mask was so well fitted by now that she barely felt it anymore. "I wanted to touch base about last week's incident." Mercer stepped slightly closer, angling his body to block her view of the trauma bay more completely. His cologne smelled like wealth and arrogance. The medication error on the surgical floor. The one involving the propofol dosing. Natalie had never made a medication error. She'd never even come close. Her charting was cleaner than most of the residents. But she'd also learned that denying things to Mercer was an exercise in futility. He didn't listen. He curated narratives. He'd been doing this for approximately 3 weeks, constructing a documented paper trail that justified whatever he'd already decided about her. "I don't recall that incident, Doctor." Measured words. Hands at her sides, not moving. "Compliant." "Well, it's in the system. We may need to bring it up at your next evaluation." His smile didn't change. "Given the liability concerns, I think it's best if you focus on the less critical patients this morning. Perhaps the floor assignment instead of trauma? We have some admissions that need intake work." The stretcher in Bay 3 flatlined audibly, the particular sound of a monitor losing its rhythm, replaced by the awful steady tone of a line going straight. Natalie heard the attending shout something about crash status, heard the rush of staff, heard the door to the trauma bay slide shut with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like a closing book. Dr. Mercer was still watching her, gauging her reaction. She could feel his satisfaction radiating like heat. He'd managed to keep her out. Whatever was happening to the general, because she knew, somehow knew with the certainty that came from having worked in trauma long enough to read the particular frequency of emergency, would happen without her, and that was exactly how Mercer wanted it. But Natalie's hands were already moving. Not because she was defying him. Because defiance required conscious thought, and she was operating on something older than conscious thought, something that had nothing to do with masks or invisibility or the careful way she'd learned to disappear. Her hands reached for the crash cart anyway, muscles remembering protocol that the Pentagon had tried to bury along with her service record. "The patient going into Bay 3, she said quietly, her voice dropping into the register it took on when she'd been working for 18 hours straight with adrenaline replacing blood. 4-star general. Explosive trauma. Hemorrhagic shock." Mercer's expression shifted, surprise first, then something harder. "How did you?" "I'm going to help." Not a request. Not even phrased as a question. She had the crash cart moving now, her body carrying the weight of it with the ease of someone who'd pushed heavier things through worse conditions. The fluid in the 4 bags caught the fluorescent light and threw tiny rainbows across the cart's metal surface. Dr. Mercer stepped aside, or she would have moved around him. He stepped aside because something in the way she'd moved, the instant transition from deferential to motion, from small to present, had registered as a category he couldn't immediately name. And in the 3 seconds it took her to push past him toward Bay 3, the ER doors swept closed behind her and the real emergency finally began. An hour later, the general's room smelled like antiseptic and fear. Natalie moved through vitals with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, blood pressure cuff, pulse ox, for line check, her fingers steady as surgical steel while the general's daughter watched from the corner chair, eyes sharp and searching. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. 94 beats per minute. Holding. The general's color had improved, his breathing less labored, his body responding to fluids and oxygen like a machine remembering how to run. Natalie wrote the numbers on his chart, 140/88, 97% saturation, and she was adjusting the 4-drip rate downward when the door opened. Dr. Mercer entered with his manufactured smile, the one he'd perfected over 23 years of moving through rooms like a man who'd never failed at anything. His white coat was pristine. His stethoscope hung like a medal. Behind him came the general's daughter's frown. She'd clearly alerted someone, complained, done what family does when they sense something wrong beneath the surface. "Miss Hayes," Mercer said, and his voice had that particular texture of rehearsed concern. "Can you explain why you've adjusted the flow rate without consulting me? Or did you simply forget your scope of practice again?" The words landed like stones in still water. The general's daughter's head snapped toward Natalie. The monitor continued its steady beeping. Natalie's hand remained on the 4 line, steady as bedrock, her thumb still positioned where she'd been adjusting the flow rate. What they didn't know, what Mercer couldn't possibly comprehend, was that Natalie's nervous system had been rewired 6 years ago in a compound outside Ramadi where the rules of medicine became the rules of survival, where you calculated drug interactions while taking fire, where you learned to read a patient's trajectory the way soldiers read terrain. 1 breath. 2. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. A single tear escaped her left eye. She wiped it without breaking contact, her jaw moving once as if she'd swallowed something difficult. Then she spoke, and her voice came out with devastating calm, the kind of quiet that makes rooms listen. "Doctor, the propofol drip you ordered is contraindicated with his current blood pressure. He's at 140/88. The literature is clear, anything above 130 systolic increases risk of respiratory depression paired with vasodilation. Would you like to explain that to his family, or shall I?" The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Mercer's smile froze on his face like something painted on. The general's daughter's eyes widened, not with doubt, but with recognition. She'd heard the tone. She'd heard someone who knew something. Mercer stepped backward as if he'd been physically shoved. "I'll have to review the patient parameters," he said, and the smoothness was gone from his voice now, replaced by something thin and sharp. He left the room with his coat flaring behind him like wounded pride. The general's daughter stared at Natalie for a long moment. Then she reached over and squeezed the older man's hand. "I trust her," she said quietly. "Dad, you're in good hands." Natalie nodded once and continued her work. By lunch, she learned the cost of being right. She pushed through the break room door at 1317 with a container of cold chicken and rice, and the space went silent like someone had hit a mute button. 3 nurses mid-conversation about a patient's lab suddenly stood up. A resident reviewing a chart suddenly needed to check something on the 2nd floor. Another nurse, Tamara, who'd actually smiled at her yesterday, grabbed her coffee and left without making eye contact. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their constant irritation. Natalie sat at the small table by the window and opened her container. The chicken had congealed slightly, the rice hardened from sitting in the refrigerator. She ate anyway, each bite deliberate, mechanical, the way soldiers eat when eating is fuel and not pleasure. She was halfway through when she understood what was happening. This wasn't random. Mercer had moved. His 3rd pretext in a month, first the fabricated medication error, then the inventory discrepancy, now the competence question in front of a family member. Each one was a stone in a wall, and she was watching him lay them in real time. The termination file was being built. She could see the architecture of it now, the careful construction, the way institutions functioned when someone decided you needed to disappear. The ER was cold in a way that had nothing to do with air conditioning. She ate her lunch alone for 23 minutes. By 1845, when shift change came and the evening staff arrived with their fresh energy and their clean scrubs, something had changed in the building's atmosphere. Natalie clocked out and moved toward the staff exit, and that's when she saw it, the public disciplinary board near the main reception desk, the one usually reserved for staff announcements and recognition certificates. Her name was printed in red marker. Staff requiring remediation. Natalie Hayes. Below it, Mercer's careful handwriting, unauthorized medication adjustments. Scope of practice violations. Requires formal review. A junior nurse in scrubs printed with cartoon cats whispered something to her preceptor as they passed. Another staff member adjusted the paper for better visibility, not to help her, but to ensure everyone could read it clearly. The message was clear. The signal had been sent. This was how institutions worked. Not with confrontation. Not with direct assault. With paperwork. With red marker. With the slow machinery of procedures and reviews and build files that accumulated like sediment until the weight of them crushed you. Natalie stood in front of the board for 6 seconds. She didn't pull the paper down. She didn't argue. She simply read her name in red marker and understood that Dr. Mercer had just escalated from social attack to strategic execution. He wasn't just bullying anymore. He was building a case. He was preparing evidence. He was doing this the way institutions did, with documentation, with witnesses, with the slow accumulation of minor infractions that eventually made someone unemployable. She turned and walked toward the parking lot, and the rain that had been threatening all day finally began to fall. But what Natalie didn't know, what nobody in Cedar Creek Medical knew as they whispered about her name on the board, as they adjusted the paper for better visibility, as they documented her competence in their careful handwriting, was that the general's monitor was about to alarm. That at 01:45, his oxygen saturation would begin a catastrophic fall. That in 1 hour and 17 minutes, Dr. Mercer would be nowhere to be found, and the real nightmare would begin. The kind of nightmare that changes careers. The kind that ends them. The monitor screamed at 0200. For separate alarms shrieking in syncopation, heart rate climbing past 140, blood pressure collapsing through the floor, oxygen saturation plummeting like a stone through dark water. The general's chest had gone rigid. His lips were blue. The night skeleton crew froze exactly where they stood, 2 nurses and a resident who'd spent his shift reviewing TikTok on his phone, none of them moving because the patient coding wasn't supposed to happen. Not after he was stable. Not after the worst had passed. Natalie was already moving. She didn't run. Runners panic. She walked from the medication cart to the crash bay with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this before, not in a hospital, but in the dirt of San Juan Valley with incoming fire turning the concrete walls to powder, with a kid from Fayetteville bleeding out through a thigh wound while mortars whistled overhead. The muscle memory was older than her nursing license. Older than Cedar Creek. Older than the version of herself that had learned to disappear. The general's right lung had collapsed inward. Tension pneumothorax. The air pocket pressing against his heart with every breath, squeezing his cardiac output down to nothing. She could see it in his color, in the way his jugular veins distended like cords about to snap. His body was screaming what his mouth couldn't say anymore. She grabbed the 14-gauge needle from the crash cart without asking permission, muscle memory didn't ask, and her hands found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact anatomical landmark she'd memorized 17 years ago at Fort Sam Houston and reconfirmed in the blood and chaos of forward operating bases where the textbook protocols were suggestions and the patient was dying regardless. "Get me a 3-way stopcock," she said. Not a question. Not deferential. Command voice. The resident jumped. The nurse who'd been standing paralyzed moved like someone had flipped a switch. Natalie's fingers located the spot between his ribs. The rhythm of anatomy never changed, whether you were in a level 1 trauma center or a combat support hospital, and she pushed the needle in with controlled precision. Smooth. Confident. A surgeon's hand. The hiss came like air escaping a tire. Like a breath being released after being held too long. The pressurized air that had been suffocating his lung evacuated in a single, perfect moment. The general's chest expanded. His color shifted from cyanotic blue back toward human. His oxygen saturation on the monitor climbed, 75, 78, 82, 85, each number ticking upward like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again. The alarm softened their screaming to background static. His lips regained color. Not pink yet. But not death blue anymore. She didn't celebrate. She didn't breathe heavy. She just adjusted the stopcock to keep the air pocket from building again, her fingers steady as surgical lasers while the resident stared at her like she'd just resurrected someone from the dead. Which, technically, she had. The general's eyes fluttered. Confusion. Disorientation. The kind of cognitive fog that comes from minutes of cerebral hypoxia. Natalie was already there, pulling a chair to his bedside, her hand finding his wrist, fingers counting beats. Strong now. Regular. 98. Stable. She didn't remove her hand. The monitors could tell her numbers. Her touch could tell her things numbers couldn't, the strength in his pulse, the temperature of his skin, the way his body was answering yes, I'm still here, I'm still fighting. Easy, sir, she said quietly. You're at Cedar Creek Medical in Norfolk. You're safe. Your name is General Edward Hayes. No, that wasn't right, she'd read his chart. Your name is General Marcus Bellamy. You've been with us for 4 days. You're stable now. The crisis has passed. His eyes tracked toward her voice. Glassy. Unfocused. His mouth moved, but the ventilator was still managing his airway, keeping him breathing while his body recovered from what just tried to kill him. The resident approached hesitantly, like he was approaching a bomb that hadn't detonated yet. That was, how did you know to? Adjust the suction on his endotracheal, Natalie interrupted. Still no please? Still no apology. The timid nurse who'd accepted humiliation in the hallway was somewhere else now, locked away in a room she'd learned to hide in during Ramadi. He's building secretions. Monitor his breath sounds every 5 minutes. If you hear a change in air entry, call me. Don't call Mercer. Call me. The resident nodded. It wasn't a request. It was a command. He moved to the ventilator without argument. Natalie settled into the chair beside the general's bed and she didn't leave it. Not for 12 hours. Not for water. Not for the bathroom. Not for the break room where she could sit for 5 minutes and remember what it felt like to be something other than invisible. Her fingers stayed on his pulse. Her eyes tracked his monitors. Every 2 hours she adjusted his for rates manually because Mercer had locked her out of the electronic system. She discovered that at 0220 when she tried to access his chart and found herself denied. So she calculated doses in her head and changed bags and marked times on the paper flow sheet with the focus of someone who understood that every minute of deviation could mean the difference between a patient who woke up and a patient who didn't. Around 0300, the general started thrashing. Delirium. His body was fighting the sedation, fighting the ventilator, fighting the very equipment keeping him alive. His eyes opened, but they weren't seeing the ceiling. They were seeing something else. Somewhere else. His voice came out in guttural sounds around the endotracheal tube, and she heard words that made her throat tighten. Delta 6, we're taking fire from the North Tower, call sign she recognized from Ramadi, from the operation that was supposed to be classified and buried forever, from the moment her team got caught in an ambush that the Pentagon would later deny had ever happened. She leaned closer. Her voice dropped an octave. General. Marcus. Listen to me. You're out of Ramadi. You're in Norfolk. You're safe. I need you to calm your breathing. Your heart rate is spiking. You need to breathe with the ventilator, not against it. Can you hear me? His eyes found her face. For a moment, just a moment, there was recognition. Not of who she was, but of what she was. Someone who'd been there. Someone who understood the weight of places that tried to kill you and wouldn't let go. Nightingale 6. His voice was barely audible, fractured around the tube. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The name had been classified when they gave it to her in the operations briefing 17 years ago. The name was supposed to die when the Pentagon buried her service record. But his recognition of it, of her, meant something had to be true. He'd been there. He'd seen her work. He'd known. "Breathing, sir. Focus on your breathing," she said. 1, 2, 3. In. Out. That's right. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. She meant it. She absolutely meant it. The monitors showed his anxiety response beginning to ease. His respiratory rate dropped from 24 breaths per minute down toward the 18 she'd set on the ventilator. His heart rate climbed down from the 140s to 110. The delirium episodes came in waves after that, sometimes 20 minutes apart, sometimes 40, and every time he climbed toward panic or called out in a voice that said he was back in the Jolan district with rounds kicking up concrete around him, Natalie was there with her voice and her steady presence and the knowledge that she was the only person in this hospital who could understand what ghosts were living inside him. 0400 arrived like all the worst hours do, quiet and dark and empty. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical hymn. Rain started hammering the window with the rhythm of automatic weapons fire, and she watched the general's body tense in response before his sedation pulled him back under. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. Her fingers on his wrist counted his pulse. Her eyes tracked every rise and fall of his chest against the ventilator's rhythm. 0500 came. Then 0530. The night shift was ending, and Natalie had been awake for 16 hours straight. Her back ached. Her left hand had gone numb from holding pressure on his arm. Her throat was dry enough that swallowing felt like glass. She didn't move. She didn't complain. She adjusted and fall line with her right hand while keeping her left on his pulse. She calculated fluid balance in her head. She watched his urine output in the catheter bag, dark and concentrated, but present, which meant his kidneys were responding, which meant his body was recovering, which meant she was winning. The general stabilized around 0545. His oxygen saturation held steady at 96. His heart rate settled into a calm, regular rhythm. His blood pressure, which had been fragile as tissue paper during the crisis, climbed back toward numbers that said he was going to live. She felt the moment his body crossed from danger into recovery. She felt it in the way his breathing synchronized with the ventilator instead of fighting it. She felt it in the strength of his pulse against her fingertips. At 0558, 2 minutes before shift change, the door opened. Mercer entered with the loyalist nurse from night rotation, the one he'd strategically placed weeks ago, Natalie realized now, and the nurse was showing him something on her phone. Footage. Natalie understood immediately what she was watching. The needle decompression. The precision. The confidence. The hands of someone who'd done this before, trained for this, lived for this in ways that didn't match the CV of a floor nurse pushing 60 who worked quietly and kept her eyes down. Mercer's face didn't change, but his eyes did. They moved from the phone to Natalie to the general's improved vitals to the chart in Natalie's lap and back again, calculating something, some trajectory of disaster that had just walked across his plan. He smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd just been handed the weapon he needed. "Miss Hayes," he said carefully, his voice carrying the false concern of a man who'd practiced cruelty long enough to make it sound like kindness. "I need to reassign your current nursing assignments. Both night shift nurses will be transferring to post-op and the 4th floor. We need better distribution of staff." It wasn't about distribution. They both knew it. It was about isolation. About removing the 2 nurses who'd seen her save the general's life, who might talk, who might say something that contradicted the narrative he was building. Natalie didn't argue. She just shifted her hand on the general's pulse and watched Mercer place his reassignment on the control computer outside the room. Then she watched as he made 3 phone calls from the hallway, his voice low and careful, words like dangerous cowboy medicine and unauthorized procedures and immediate competency review. She watched him file paperwork. She watched him build the case that would become her termination, one careful brick at a time, using the thing that had just saved someone's life as the evidence he needed to destroy her. By 0600, when the day shift arrived, the trap was complete. Within minutes of the decompression needle sliding back into her pocket, the ICU doors hissed open and Dr. Mercer entered like a man who'd already won. He wasn't alone. Behind him came the night shift nurse he'd cultivated carefully over 3 months, a younger woman named Claire who'd accepted his mentorship the way drowning people accept rope, grateful and unquestioning. Mercer moved to the general's bedside with the calculated ease of someone surveying conquered territory, his eyes landing on the ventilator settings, the medication drips, the monitor displays that all told the story of a patient pulled back from the edge by someone other than him. He didn't speak to Natalie. He spoke into his phone, voice low and steady like a prosecutor building a case for jurors not yet in the room. Yes, the procedure was unauthorized, he said. No physician oversight. I have a witness. Claire nodded, small and trembling, and Natalie understood then that fear was Mercer's currency. He'd taught that girl to trade her conscience for the promise of not being next. The strategic moves began with surgical precision. By 0300, Mercer had reassigned every competent staff member from the General's Care Unit. Gone was Marcus, the respiratory therapist with 15 years of ICU experience who knew how to read a chest X-ray like scripture. Gone was Delia, the charge nurse who'd spent 20 years at Walter Reed and could predict deterioration before machines could measure it. In their place came new faces, competent enough, but lacking the institutional knowledge, the pattern recognition that came from thousands of hours at the bedside. By 0400, Natalie discovered her electronic access to the general's chart had been restricted. The password still worked for routine screens, vitals, medication reconciliation, but the imaging archive was locked. The lab results required special authorization. The pharmacy notes were flagged as restricted personnel. She was being erased from the system in real time, reduced to someone who could see a patient but not understand him, could touch him but not know why. Her hand steadied as she kept working anyway, relying on the muscle memory that had nothing to do with passwords or credentials. She read the monitors the way she read breath, counting syllables in the chest wall, measuring pupil response, tracking the subtle shifts in blood pressure that meant the body was singing a song only experience could translate. Mercer's phone calls happened in the hallway, his voice carrying through the permeable walls of a 0500 morning when the hospital held its breath between night and day. She heard fragments, dangerous cowboy medicine, liability exposure, unauthorized procedures outside scope of practice, phrases designed to sound professional while describing her as a threat. The emergency competency review paperwork was being assembled even as she changed the generals for dressing, her hands moving through the work while her mind calculated the distance between what she'd done and what they were preparing to say she'd done. It was a familiar math. The Pentagon had done something similar after Ramadi, reframed her Silver Star Valor as excessive engagement, her Purple Heart wounds as lapses in tactical judgment, her saved soldiers as fortunate outcomes of reckless intervention. The procedure had changed the terminology but not the mechanics. Erase the truth. Replace it with something that sounded reasonable. Make sure the person doing the erasing had institutional power and the person being erased had nothing but competence and scars. She didn't sleep during those 12 hours. Sleep was a luxury for people who could afford to miss something, the change in breath sounds, a subtle shift in oxygenation, a medication interaction that would take a life while they were unconscious. Instead, she moved through the ICU like a ghost made of vigilance, adjusting the propofol drip when his blood pressure climbed, managing the fentanyl infusion with the precision of someone who understood that pain was data and data was the difference between living and dying. The general drifted in and out of morphine dreams, and she talked him through the delirium with the low, steady voice she'd learned in field hospitals, not the voice of a nurse, but the voice of someone who'd held 14 soldiers together while rounds impacted the reinforced concrete. "You're at Cedar Creek," she told him during a 0340 moment when his eyes went unfocused and his body went rigid with panic. "You're safe. General. You're okay." The sound of her voice pulled him back from whatever dark desert his subconscious was reconstructing. His hand found hers. Held on like an anchor. Released only when the sedation brought him back down to the place where survival didn't require consciousness. The shift change came at 0600 like a guillotine blade, and by 0615 security arrived with the kind of quiet efficiency that meant no one had argued about the legality of what they were about to do. The termination order was printed on official hospital letterhead, dated that morning, signed by hospital administration, people Mercer had clearly briefed before Natalie's first coffee of that shift. Effective immediately, the security officer said, his voice carrying the rehearsed sympathy of someone who'd done this enough times to know the script. For an authorized procedures outside scope of practice. She didn't argue. Arguments were for people who believed the system worked. Instead, she removed her badge and set it on the desk with the care of someone placing flowers on a grave. The security officer handed her a cardboard box, the kind they used for archives, too small for a life's worth of belonging. She filled it mechanically. The cracked ceramic mug from the nursing students in her first year of practice, world's okayest nurse, the letters faded from 1,000 dishwasher cycles. The succulent she'd kept alive on the break room window for 3 years, its leaves thick and waxy despite the fluorescent light that sustained it like a prisoner in solitary. The photograph from before the ambush, 14 faces in digital camouflage, her hand steady as a surgical laser even then, even when they didn't know what was coming. She left behind 2 textbooks about critical care nursing, the backup shoe stored under her desk for nights when her feet swelled beyond the point of tolerance, a sweater she'd bought on a day off 5 years ago. The box closed with the sound of finality. The rain started somewhere between the hospital and the bus stop on Granby Street, first as mist, then as sheets that came sideways with the kind of Atlantic persistence that suggested it had no intention of stopping. The cardboard began to soften immediately, the bottom corner going translucent, moisture seeping through like the box was crying. She sat on the bench despite the wet, the box balanced on her lap, water streaming down her face in a way that made it impossible to distinguish rain from tears, not that the distinction mattered anymore. Her phone buzzed at 0630, a text from her son, "Mom, where are you?" School called, said you listed Dad as primary contact but he's deployed. The words hit like shrapnel. Her son would be 17 in December. He was supposed to think his mother was somewhere stable, somewhere normal, somewhere that made sense. Instead she was sitting in rain on a bus bench at dawn with a cardboard box falling apart in her lap, her son calling a deployed father who wouldn't answer, her career officially terminated, her saved general asleep 3 blocks away because of hands that were supposed to be invisible. She closed her eyes. The succulent tipped over inside the box, soil spilling onto the photograph, the black dirt coating the faces of 14 soldiers, covering the face of Sergeant Marcus Chen who died first, whose blood she'd never managed to wash completely from her boots. The bus was late. The rain got harder. Traffic splashed through puddles, sending cold spray across the bench, and she didn't move because moving suggested acceptance, suggested the beginning of whatever came after. But there was no after. There was only this, sitting in rain, holding the pieces of an erased life, waiting for a bus that probably wouldn't come because nothing in this version of her existence was supposed to work. Then footsteps. Running. Splashing through puddles like someone who'd learned urgency from somewhere deeper than fear. Her son's voice, breathless and determined, cutting through the sound of the storm of "Mom, they need to see these." He was holding the shadow box, the one she'd hidden in the attic for years ago, behind the Christmas decorations no one had used since his father deployed. Her medals caught the streetlight through the glass case, water streaming down the shadow box like rain, like tears from something that had learned to cry in her absence. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause nobody wanted. Her son stood there soaked through, chest heaving, eyes burning with the kind of determination that only comes from watching your mother disappear. The shadow box was held high, not in triumph, but in defiance. Through the wet glass, her medals caught the streetlight. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Bronze Star. The citations typed in official military language, each word a sentence she'd been ordered never to speak aloud. "Mom, they need to see these," he said. Not a question. A command. The same tone she'd taught him years ago, the one that meant there was no negotiation, no backing down. Natalie stood up, the cardboard box dropping from her lap. "Baby, no. You don't understand what." But he was already moving toward the hospital entrance, the shadow box held like a banner, like a declaration of war against every silence she'd kept to protect him. She chased him through the automatic doors, her wet scrubs clinging to her skin like a second failure, calling his name in a voice too quiet to stop anything. The ER hallway froze. Nurses mid-stride. A resident paused with a chart. Security glanced up from their desk. Her son walked straight past them, past the front desk, past the nurse's station, his eyes locked on the ICU wing where the 4-star general lay in room for 12. The shadow box reflected in the polished tile floor as he moved, medals bouncing light across white linoleum like a trail of evidence. They didn't stop him. Nobody stopped him. In the general's ICU room, the old soldier's eyes snapped open the moment the doors swung wide. Not confused. Not foggy from sedation. Instantly present. Instantly awake. His jaw worked once, twice, and then he whispered with the kind of reverence that only comes from a man who'd spent 30 years commanding soldiers across deserts and mountains and through every impossible place war dragged him. Nightingale 6. The name. The call sign. The one she'd buried so deep it didn't belong to anyone anymore. Hospital administration started pouring in, CEO, Chief of Staff, Risk Management, the hospital lawyer in his charcoal suit already calculating liability. They stood in the doorway like funeral attendees, uncertain whether they were supposed to speak. The general's daughter gripped the bedrail, eyes moving from her father to the shadow box to Natalie's face, piecing together something that had been hidden her entire life. A Marine colonel appeared from the ICU waiting room, visiting from Portsmouth Naval Station. He'd been sitting with the general's family for 3 days. When he saw the medals, he straightened. His boots snapped to attention on the hospital tile. He stepped forward with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, made everyone in the room remember they were standing next to somebody who'd spent decades handling matters of life and death. "Captain," he said. Not a greeting. An acknowledgement of rank. He reached for the Silver Star citation, his eye scanning the words with the weight of a man who understood exactly what they meant. His voice cracked on the second line. Sustained casualties while treating 14 wounded under direct fire in Ramadi. He paused. The room held its breath. Refused evacuation despite 2 separate orders to withdraw. Continued medical operations despite incoming fire. Maintained patient survival rate of 91% under active combat conditions. Each sentence hit the room like shrapnel. 2 administrators stepped back. The CEO's hand lowered. The general's breathing picked up on the ventilator, a monitor that had been flatline steady for days suddenly showing the spike of a man fighting to move, to acknowledge, to salute a subordinate he'd sent into the desert and never expected to see again. And then a tablet appeared. The Pentagon liaison, the woman who'd delivered the classified jacket that first day, who'd watched Natalie work in the shadows for 6 years, stepped into the ICU with the kind of calm authority that made every hospital credential in the room feel suddenly temporary. The tablet showed Natalie's service record. Photographs. Deployment dates. The code name that had been redacted from every official document, the word that made 2 hospital administrators actually step backward like they'd been physically pushed. The colonel held up the folded flag from Ramadi. The one Natalie had kept hidden. It unfurled in his hands, a 3x5 standard-issue American flag, rumpled from being smuggled home in a medical pack, the fabric discolored where it had absorbed things nobody asked about. In Ramadi, that flag had draped over the cot of Sergeant Marcus Webb, a 23-year-old from Lynchburg, Virginia, who'd bled out in her arms during a firefight that lasted for minutes and 40 seconds. She'd held the flag afterward. She'd brought it home. She'd never told anyone it existed. The general's hand rose from the bed. Not a reach for water. Not a reflex. A salute. His hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the effort of commanding his own body one more time, raising his palm to his forehead in the formal acknowledgement of rank and sacrifice. Her son stood with the shadow box still held high. By noon the next day, the video had 10,000 views. By 1400, it was 50,000. Her son's live stream from his phone, the timestamp showing 2,247 hours last night, captured every moment. The automatic doors. Natalie chasing him down the hallway. The general's eyes opening. The medals catching light. And there, unmistakable, was Dr. Mercer's face in the background. He'd responded to the commotion, emerged from his office in the administrative wing. His face wore that expression, the sneer that had become his default when looking at nurses, the curled lip that said he was above this, above her, above the entire concept of what was happening. In the video, someone had zoomed in on his expression the moment the colonel began reading the Silver Star citation. The moment Mercer understood that the invisible nurse he'd spent a week trying to destroy was actually a decorated combat veteran. The hashtag trended by evening, #Nightingale6. 50,000 views became 200,000. Military subreddits shared it. Military spouse pages shared it. Combat veteran communities shared it. And among those viewers, scrolling through his phone at 1900 hours in a quiet apartment in Arlington, was Dr. James Halloway, retired Army surgeon, the man who'd taught Mercer emergency medicine 20 years ago at Johns Hopkins. The man who'd written Mercer's initial letters of recommendation. The man who'd believed in him. Halloway watched the video twice. Once in shock. Once in recognition of his own failure to see who he'd trained. At 1930, he posted to his verified military medical Twitter account, "For sentences that would change everything. This is Dr. Edward Mercer, whom I mentored 20 years ago." This video shows him mocking a decorated combat veteran. A Silver Star recipient. What you see is not medical debate. It's a betrayal of every oath we take. I disavow him completely. The post went viral in 47 minutes. By 2000, the hospital board was in emergency session. By 2100, the Pentagon liaison had provided Cedar Creek CEO with a list of interesting discrepancies. Phantom procedures. Inflated coding. Insurance claims for treatments never rendered. A pattern. Careful. Deliberate. Worth exactly $340,000 in fraudulent charges across 18 months. By 2200, the compliance officer's preliminary report was on the CEO's desk. By midnight, Dr. Edward Mercer's hospital credentials were suspended pending investigation. By 0400, his medical license entered review with the state board. Mercer's calls went unanswered. His allies suddenly had no memory of their friendship. The nurses who'd avoided sitting with Natalie at lunch suddenly remembered every condescending comment, every moment Mercer had made them feel small, every time he'd used his position to demean them. Their statements filled a binder 3 inches thick. The loyalist staff he'd strategically placed during night shifts quietly transferred to other hospitals. The carefully constructed file of manufactured complaints against Natalie was reopened, each fabricated medication error examined, cross-referenced, revealed as fiction. 6 months. That's how long it took for the system to correct itself once the truth stopped hiding. Natalie Hayes wore her captain's bars openly now, embroidered onto her white coat in the official Navy Medical Corps insignia. Her office sat on the 3rd floor of Cedar Creek Medical, and on her desk sat the folded flag from Ramadi beside a photograph of the 4-star general, awake, alive, his hand clasping her son's shoulder at his Special Forces graduation ceremony last month. The medals her son had forced into the light now hung in a display case on her office wall. Not hidden anymore. Not ashamed anymore. The cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" sat beside them, because she'd learned that small, ordinary things could hold as much truth as medals did. The general had recovered fully. His daughter sent flowers every week, 12 weeks of them, each arrangement accompanied by handwritten cards that thanked Natalie for giving her father back. Her son had graduated top of his Special Forces class, carrying the legacy she'd tried to bury. The Pentagon liaison visited quarterly, ensuring she was adjusting to visibility after 6 years as a ghost, and each visit ended the same way, a quiet nod of respect from someone who understood exactly what it meant to carry classified wounds that never appeared in official reports. Dr. Mercer taught CPR fundamentals at Tidewater Community College now. Minimum wage. Teenagers who checked their phones during demonstrations. He would never practice medicine again. The criminal charges were pending trial. His carefully built empire, constructed on condescension and fraud, had collapsed in exactly 48 hours once the truth became visible. During a staff meeting 3 weeks into her new role, a young nurse, fresh from nursing school, terrified of making mistakes, invisible in her own way, asked Natalie what she'd learned from everything that had happened. What advice she'd give to someone just starting out. Natalie touched the folded flag. Thought about Sergeant Marcus Webb bleeding out in Ramadi. Thought about the 4-star general gasping back to life in this hospital. Thought about her son, who'd saved her by refusing to let her hide. Thought about every sacrifice that had been made invisible by orders she'd followed. Power is not a title, Natalie said. Her voice had dropped an octave from the deferential nurse she'd been. It now carried the weight of someone who'd held lives together in both deserts and hospitals. Power is the ability to help. Through her office window, she watched new nurses on their first day, scared, uncertain, moving through corridors like ghosts. She made a note on her calendar to learn all their names. Every single one. Because invisible people needed to be seen. Like and subscribe if you love stories about people who've been underestimated. Comment below if you've ever had someone doubt you and you proved them wrong. Let's get back to it.